Welcome to the second in our series, Seminar on Self. The first dealt with the fruits of transformation, and this deals with the process of transformation. Now, the basic equation, as you may recall, of self-transformation is that it equals two processes. First, self-realization, and that followed up by self-cultivation. So the center of transformation is oneself. Let's remind ourselves of this, as Buddha had said, Gautama Buddha. Look not for a refuge in anyone but yourself. The purpose of self-transformation is to free oneself from suffering and to attain true happiness. This is a universal, innate aspiration in everyone. It's a worthwhile pursuit, therefore, to find out indeed what it is that brings about happiness. If we look, we see that self-cultivation is actually a matter of, if you look at the little graphic that I've represented, the happiness is at the center, but how do you achieve that? What really feeds in to what one would consider a happy life? Well, there are four things. There's wisdom and serenity, virtue and skills. However, self-transformation is not a goal, but a pursuit with a process. The process of self-realization where one uncovers, discovers, and recovers one's performative power of self, in both its individual and its universal aspect, that is, the small self and the large self that we discussed last time. This is complemented by self-cultivation, where the powers of one's realized self is developed in four ways, in four gardens, if you will. Wisdom is cultivated through clear awareness of you as you exist in your 10 dimensions. Virtue is cultivated through striving towards purposes that fulfill your fundamental needs as a spiritual being by building and strengthening character, which is but another name for the enduring psychological aspects, talents, traits, and abilities of one's evolved self through deliberate effort. And then there are skills that are cultivated through the unfoldment of the 10 types of human intelligence. And remember, we discussed these just briefly last time. We'll go into them a bit more later on. However, as a reminder, there's visual intelligence, which is picture smart. There's linguistic intelligence, which is word smarts, and there's number or logical reasoning smart. And then there's kinesthetic, which is body smart, and naturalist, which is nature smart. There's musical, which is, of course, sound smart, and existential, which makes one life smart. There's interpersonal, which, as we all know, is people smart. And then there's intrapersonal, which is self-smart, and that's the same as knowing about the 10 dimensions of yourself and your contents of self. And then there's transpersonal intelligence, which is cosmos-smart. Lastly, of the four gardens, serenity is cultivated by treating all sentient beings as ends in themselves, all having equal precious value, which you come to cherish as much as your own life. So what gets grown in these four gardens of merit? The seeds of wisdom sown ripen into enlightenment. The seeds of virtue sown ripen into empowerment. The seeds of skills sown ripen into emancipation. And the seed of serenity sown ripen into endearment. Yet in all this, self-experience is the basis of all transformation. So, let's ask ourselves, what is experience? Note that by asking that question, it's the same thing as Socrates insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living. And by asking that question, you really are challenging Friedrich Nietzsche, which you might recall made the observation in his A Genealogy of Morals. We are unknown, we knowers, ourselves to ourselves. What? We don't know ourselves? How in the world did that happen? Well, here's the nub and the rub of it all. The rub is, according to Nietzsche, we don't know ourselves. In fact, he says we're unknown to ourselves. How we got that way is the nub. Now, that's the kernel of the dilemma. So let's get a word from the wise. Well, according to the rishis, the seers of the perennial philosophy of ancient India, sometimes it's called the ageless wisdom and even the ancient wisdom, we are all ignorant in a very primal sense. That's primal ignorance. Now, that's due to our finite nature and the limit to what we can know. This primal ignorance of the whole, the infinite, that's the nub of our problem. There's a whole world, but we find ourselves only as a self-centered aspect of it, limiting ourselves to using just only those parts of the world that best suit our needs or fulfill some thrill or want or desire that we might have so that we might thrive. In other words, we find a use value for the things in the world that matters to us. As for what constitutes the rest of the world, we couldn't care less, of course, unless we're challenged by some part of it from the comfort of getting what we want. Well, taking a pragmatic view of the world, seeing it only for what its practical worth is to oneself alone, limits our knowledge of the world as it really is. We interpret it only in terms of our self-centered ego and its fulfillment of needs along what's come to be known, thanks to Abraham Maslow, as the hierarchy of needs. So let's visit the nub and rub again. So consequently, our view of the world in terms of how it meets our needs leads to a view of self-preservation at all costs and self-gratification, often at a high cost to others. This self-centered attitude becomes self-reinforcing until we are caught in the web of our own designs, however unintended. However, attending to only our individual needs makes us an adversary of the world which functions interdependently, organically, holistically, all at once and in time with itself. After a while, we become our own worst enemies, enduring the effects we put into motion out of a limited point of view and without regard to the impact on others who coexist in this world. But we compound our primal ignorance. In other terms, what was at first our finite self only looking out for its own utilitarian interest has now been compounded into a persistent ignorance that not only won't go away, but now being crystallized, will become the self-serving basis that will continue to govern your body, your mind, your heart, your consciousness, until you wake up. The bell has to go off in your own head. When you become conscious of being conscious, you will have turned the mental key that unlocks the door to the 10 dimensions of yourself. Remember, as Sri Buddhiraja has said, The method of attaining the goal is to be constantly awake to one's own awareness. Realizing those 10 dimensions frees you from a set of snares that has entrapped the self in ignorance. This primal ignorance of the self that interprets the world only from its own point of view is deep. It is covered by, coupled with, and reinforced through the persistent ignorance we individually construct. These I call the bonds of cis formation. Instead of transformation into a higher progressive, harmonic, organic existence, you regress into a form of existence where it is necessarily self-thwarting, and you obstruct your own progress in a world that is meant to have you enlightened and endeared and empowered and emancipated. There are 5 types of persistent ignorance. As we look at the bonds of self-disformation, you're going to see another graphic in which at the center is expectance. Well, this is the expectance of consciousness. This is where you cover all the things that you consider as irrelevant, and you almost go insomnolent. You become soporific, dull, insipid in your awareness, without an edge, without a focus, and without the peripheral vision, all taken in at once. Instead, you go through life as a robot, reprogrammed, much of it by your own design, which you constantly reinforce. We all do this. That's why it's important to be conscious of what you are conscious of, because often you are not conscious of much at all. Next is the enfeeblement of will. You'll notice now that relates to the will aspect. A cis formation that doesn't allow you to exercise your will enfeebles your sovereignty, enfeebles your freedom, enfeebles your liberty to be creative. Enchantment is what holds the mind captive. Just as estrangement holds the heart captive, and enslavement holds your actions captive. We all enslave ourselves by not even considering the options that open us to a new world we fashion. Remember what Abraham Lincoln said? He says, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So, after looking at those cis formations, let's remember this. Those are based on actual formations, experiential self-formations. These are the forms of experience that we all have. Now, the cis formations lead to things such as happiness and suffering because they obstruct uncovery, discovery, and recovery of the full potentials and powers of your fundamental free consciousness. But if you're leveraging the basis of experience through self-realization and self-cultivation, it'll change all that. That negativity that is malformed into these cis formations, these formations that denote experience that's been demoted, can be reformed and transformed, that promotes happiness. These are the fruits of transformation. These can be transformational experiences functioning in the daily life as the enlightening mind, the empowering will, the emancipating life, and endearing love. The experiential basis of self-transformation, as you see, what is the nature of experience? Well, when experience devolves, it becomes expectance. Experience itself, however, as we are all experiencing at this moment, is an entrainment of mind. Your mind is entrained. It's following a certain train of thought. I'm following a train of thought, and if you're following along, you have an entrained mind. There's also entertainment. Now, what is entertainment? That relates to the desire realm. Entertainment actually is a word that means what exists between us. What is entertained? Well, what is entertained are common concepts and common experiences. And then there's endowment. It's the endowments that we all have. It's the character that is the chest, if you will, of all our enduring beliefs, worldview, motivations, memories. Those are all endowments. These are all things we carry with us from moment to moment. Now, if you misuse these things, you become enfeebled. Just as if you misuse entertainment, you can become estranged, bored, cut off from the world, feeling cut off from the world. And then, of course, at the level of experience, in terms of your basic living, that is your engagement. These are the things that engage your senses, such as the sounds that are going to your ears from my voice to your ears and being processed there. Well, I'm processing the voice similarly. These are all things that I'm encountering. We are encountering. You encounter from your perspectival self, we covered last time, we touched on, and I from my perspectival self. And of course, if one practices self-realization and self-cultivation, you take these basic elements of experience and you turn it into happiness, or the Greek term eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is when all these things are functioning together harmonically. And that means your enlightenment, your emancipation, your endearment, your empowerment, they're all working together. Life is not a cycle. Life is not a line. Life is a line moving through a cycle, creating a spiral. We all spiral upward, or we all spiral down. And there are parts of us that spiral each way, every day, in any way. And it's important to be aware, to realize what's spiraling where. So, let's take a look at the chart of self-transformation, if you will. As you can tell, there are three basic components here in terms of self-transformation to your right. That's what the yield is going to be. And then there's the components of self-realization, where you uncover and discover and recover the dimensions of yourself. And then there's the experiencing part of self-cultivation, where you deliberately and intentionally cultivate wisdom, virtue, skills, and serenity. Now, if you take a look at that chart, you'll see that in the first column of self-realization, there are the two modes that we spoke of last time. There's the realization of the universal self, that is the ground of all self, the selfness of self. How can there be a self unless there is a potential of self? How can there be an actual experiencing self unless there is a ground to that self where that self is aware of itself? In two dimensions, the universal dimension, that is self-realization, all capitals this time, and self-realization, which is recognizing these 10 dimensions within your entire self. You're going to uncover, discover, and recover all those 10 dimensions. As we went over them last time, there's the bodily self. Now, it's interesting, but this is your sensing and your acting self. Remember, you have actually two sets of senses, bodily senses. The Hindus call them the Indriyas. That is your senses, your receptive sensors, and these are your jnanendriyas, and those they list as the typical 5 that we're aware of, right? You can see, you can hear, you can smell, you can taste, you can feel. But then you have 5 active senses. These they call the karman indriyas. And these are locomotion. Your feet can take you from one spot to another. Manipulation. I can manipulate things. Speech. And then there's procreation, where I can replicate this very body. And there's elimination, where the food I take in, I can utilize and eliminate from this body. It's an open-ended systems, as we say in system theory. So, those two selves, the sensing and the acting self, you feel invested in all the time. Except when you're sleeping, of course. Then we mentioned there's the perspectival self, that is your observing self, it's your own unique point of view on the world. Nobody else has it, and that includes, as well as the emotions and feelings you have at any given moment, the thought content that you have, your intentionality, the things that you intend to do, the things you are actually engaged in doing. Those all belong to that perspectival self. But then there's the emotional self. There's the self that you feel is real. There's the self where you know what it is that you believe. You know what it is that you know, for instance, that I'm talking. I know that I'm talking. I feel it. I don't need anybody to prove it to me through a deductive syllogism. I don't need anyone to point it out to me through testimony. All I need to do is feel it. That's your feeling self. And actually, that's the self that pulls all those aspects together. Your thoughts and opinions, your sentiments, your emotions, the memories that you've had, and gives them a psyche, gives them a psychological self, where it seems as if all the stars are in the universe, but it's your universe. That's the emotional self. Then there's the narrating self. That's that voice that goes along in your head and tells you about yourself and about someone else, or narrates what's going on, or when you still it and it's silent, you hear something much deeper. Then there's the volitional self. That's the self that wills to do something. I will to come here today. You will to listen or to continue to listen. You'll will all kinds of things throughout the day, and this is your volitional self, your willing self. And then there's your social self, which really is your imagining self, based on empathy, where you believe that someone sees you in a certain way, that someone has an image of you other than the image you hold of yourself. In other words, there are images floating around out in other people's minds of you. So you imagine what it is that they are seeing about you, as if you are going to haunt their perspectival self. And what is it that they are narrating about, for instance, you? Or how do they feel about a political situation? Or how do they feel about a lottery they've just won? Whatever it is, you're imagining it. You're empathizing with it. That's your social self. Then there's the continuing self. As I said, that's the self you wake up to every morning. That's the self that you re-engage when you say, well, I'm conscious of being conscious. Well, where was I when I wasn't aware of being aware? You don't pick up at somebody else's shoes of identity. You continue in the same identical shoes you had before. You're convinced that this is an enduring self. So that's your continuing self. And then there's the unifying self. And that's the self that puts it all together and says, you know, that all belongs to me. The perspective, my body, my emotions, the way I feel about my thoughts, the way I narrate or dialogue internally, all the different social selves I have of other people seeing me as I think they see me, all of that. Even the continuing self, it has to be unified, right? That continuing self can't go off one way, and then your emotional self go off another. That wouldn't be a coherent, united, organized self. So that's your unifying self. Then there's the advancing self. It's not only that you're organized internally as a structural consciousness, however, you're making progress. How is that happening? You are accumulating experiences. You're cultivating virtue and wisdom and serenity and skills. You're always adding to whatever it is you were before. In Whitehead's terms, you're the many plus one. The moment anew, you, anew, you, plus everything that went before. That's the event. But then there's an identifying self. There's a self that puts its mark, if you will, and its seal on every single thought and deed and motion and commotion and emotion and disformation and transformation you ever have. It's all identified as you, yours, mine. I identify with my body. I identify with my emotions. There are times I identify with my narrating self, and there's times I identify with the way people see me. I might feel horrible or related because I interpret them seeing me in such a fashion. But in each one of those, there is the seal of identity. It is me. It is mine. I have made it mine. We'll go into that another time. All these aspects of consciousness being personal and private and phenomenal and performative, etc. We'll do that at another time. But for now, when you harmonize these 10 dimensions through your experience, that is where you are going to develop the talents of self-cultivation. It's not uniquely developed by you, although there is a universal fourfold methodology which we talked about. There's wisdom, which is the clear awareness of who you are. Now, in order to establish that, we talked about the formula, I am conscious of being conscious. Well, that's called metacognition. You're not just cognizing my voice, but you're aware of cognizing my voice, metacognition. Then there's virtue, which is what? What is virtue? It's purposeful orientation in the world. You're oriented with a purpose. You're not just willy-nilly moving one way or another. You know what samsara means? It means wandering. That's the Buddhist term for this world. We're all wanderers until you find an orientation. Mark Twain said it best. He says, the two most important days of your life are when you were born and when you learn why. Now, that's your moral grounding. Just as metacognition is your key to developing wisdom, your moral grounding is the key to cultivating virtue. That inner strength, that power that is going to hurl you into the future through the fire of your own will. Then, as you develop the 10 types of intelligence, you'll develop skills. And this is essentially going to allow you to give expert service. And I mean service in the terms of goodwill. Doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. You need skillful means. You have to know how to help somebody. If you're going to be a nurse or a doctor or a practitioner of health, you must know how to help. You must have the skills and be properly trained. And that's what you're doing. With your 10 types of intelligence, you are honing the skills by which you will render service to humanity and to all sentient beings. And then there is, of course, the Garden of Serenity. And that's treating all beings not only as equals, but absolutely precious. And when you do, and they are endeared to you, and you are endearing to them, at that point you attain inner peace. For inner peace is nothing more than all love returning and being returned. Well, together these dimensions reveal the interrelationships between the absolute and the relative individual self. As we've went through each one of those in some amount of detail, I am going to place here for your perusal the 10 dimensions of self. And I should note, any of you, if you want any of these graphics or literature, you'll be able to have them sent to you by contacting the email here that's at the end of this program. The process of 10-dimensional self-realization can be accomplished by utilizing 5 tools. I call them the 5 tools of awakening consciousness. You'll notice that at the center is the reflective consciousness. That's the consciousness which opens up when you turn the key. I am conscious of being conscious. And you're aware of your contents of consciousness. And as you are, you're going to use that as your first tool. Self-awareness. Now, what are you aware of? First thing that you might want to be aware of is you want to be mindful of your thinking. What is it that is going on as object or thought in your mind? The next is whenever you're in a scene or you're in a situation, you can have appreciative feeling. That's the second tool. And I'm not just talking about a painting, I'm talking about when you're engaged in conversation with someone, or even when you're being entertained by a movie. It's to actually own the appreciative feeling, to appreciate what it is that you're experiencing at the moment. Whatever you do. The third tool is focused acting. Instead of merely doing something in an unconscientious and half-distracted fashion, fully focus on it. Professionals do this all the time. That's the only way an athlete can possibly accomplish what they envision as their goal. Which brings us to our fourth tool, deliberate willing. Henry David Thoreau once gave some apt advice for all of this. He says, live deliberately. Well, here, deliberate willing is not letting something or someone, including even your own desires, make up your will for you. Not your mind, but your will. Your will and your desire and your mind are all three different things, as are the deeds you perform. From practicing and utilizing these tools, you'll eventually awaken your consciousness, and that is going to have an impact upon the world. In our next session, we'll speak more of these tools of the awakening consciousness and how it impacts the world with the 5 contributions of awakened consciousness to the world, which you'll notice very quickly I'll touch on now. At the center is your axiomatic sense. That's your sense of certainty. What are the things that are the absolute truisms in your life that give it a sense of unity? And then, following as we did our tools, beginning with the thinking aspect, we'll look at the alethic sense, which is that sense of truth that we all have from the Greek word aletheia, which meant openness and undisclosed and truthfulness. It's authenticity. So, your alethic sense is the sense that verifies reality for you and yields truth. And then your third tool, consequently, would be using your aesthetic sense, and that's the sense of beauty, the sense of value. And there's beauty not just in a sunset or a painting, but as we all know, in a child's ingenuous demeanor, in the simple play of pets, in the feelings we have that soar toward the sky. Wonder in the aesthetic sense leads to the discovery of beauty. And our fourth tool is our authorial sense, and that's from a word that means to author and to know that you're authoring. So you know that you're the author of your own deeds, right? You speak your own mind, you form your own opinions, all these things that you authentically experience as doing yourself leads to power. And lastly, the aretaic sense comes from the Greek word arete, which means virtue, and virtue is strength. And strength is fitting in with the whole. That's goodness. The Buddhists speak of the world being dukkha. In fact, the Buddha's first truth is all existence is suffering. And the word for suffering is dukkha in Sanskrit, and it means out of joint. It's sort of like when you've got a wheel, instead of having a perfect hub at the center, it's slightly moved here. But the wheel never moved uniformly. That's dukkha. The contrary of that is sukha. And sukha is when things are aligned and in joint, so that the wheel moves as we expect all 4 wheels on our car to move. There's no wobbling or hobbling. That's that aretaic sense that moral sense, as it's often been described, leads to goodness. So we will deal with those the next time, but remember this, that ultimate happiness and relative happiness are what lie at the end of self-transformation's trail. Ultimate happiness is dependent on discovering oneness of self through your conscious union with the ground of being. Sometimes it's been personified as God, and often it's just been left as ground. Whether theist or atheist, ultimate happiness does not depend on a concept. It depends on itself. The more you consciously are at one with yourself and what you share with the whole by way of fundamental being, the more blissful you'll be. That's sukha. Nonetheless, your relative happiness in this multi-dimensional world of forms, whether they be physical, emotional, intellectual, volitional, whatever, is dependent on your knowing your finite self in all your many relative dimensions, thereby establishing unity of yourself and identity of yourself with the oneness of self. So as a parting spiritual exercise today, take a look at this mindfulness listing I've made. Mindfulness we'll use for the deepening of self-realization, which, remember last time, the key was given, I am conscious that I am conscious. So this time we will deepen that discovery. You walk through the door of mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? Well, it's holding the bare attention while consciously being aware of yourself manifesting in one or more of your 10 dimensions. It is observing your thoughts, feelings, actions, and intentions, as well as the objects around you, whether inanimate or animate. You would pay attention to both internal and external phenomena. Mindfulness is also recalling your mind to bear attention and sustained investigation when attention is lost due to distraction. Therefore, mindfulness is attending to what's present, analyzing its coming to be, continuance and dissolution, noticing the novel, what's new, and recalling the mind to being conscious of itself when necessary. So, until the next time, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can. But above all else, be yourself.